Hey, violists, how are you? Happy Mental Health Week. It's Monday. We just got done with a great first day of Mental Health Week. Unfortunately, outside we have snow, which was not a welcome sight, but it's melting already. That's Iowa for you. Today, the presentation that I'd like to give, or this video, is about ornamentation in the Baroque era. I had alluded to that in the last video. And this is just a brief guide of some general rules that you can take with you to apply to your Baroque playing. It's not as daunting as you might think it is. So don't be too afraid. Now, performers in the Baroque era would have been well trained in ornamentation. It would have been, like playing scales. You would practice your ornamentation. You would know a lot of the methods and rules and the expectations, but we don't have that today unless we're a Baroque specialists and spend our entire livelihood devoted to Baroque playing. So today there's greater expectations. The first thing to do, and I mentioned this in yesterday's video, is make sure you have a really good edition. Do not get a performer's edition that is not based on scholarship and knowledge of ornamentation. Usually these so-called urtext editions, the good ones, and Baron Reiter and Henley are two of the best publishers of these types of editions, will have a wonderful preface that offers a lot of information, not only about the piece, the composer, and the methods of editing, but also some notes on interpreting ornamentation, amongst others. So once you found your good part or your good edition, you can go from there. Good places to find some online free manuscript copies or early editions are IMSLP or the Bach Leipzig archive in Germany. You can Google both of those. Now, another thing I would suggest is having some good reference books, and you don't have to spend a lot of money. You probably don't even have to buy anything if you can find a good website. But I'll suggest a few books. Let me go to screen share here. And I thought I'd show this just so you can see if you want to take a note. This is a very inexpensive book from Alfred Music Publishing, Ornamentation, a Question and Answer Manual. It's really good, basic, and well-written book. This is sort of the Bible, this On Playing the Flute by Quantz, that I would highly recommend investing in a copy. And then this great big book, Ornamentation in the Baroque and Post-Baroque, Frederick Neumann. It's considered to be the most thorough reference book on Baroque and Post-Baroque ornamentation, though some scholars have a few arguments with some of his interpretations or ideas. Okay, so those are some resources I'd recommend. Now, Baroque style and ornamentation are part of two schools of playing. It's French or Italian. German is composers use one or the other or both, or mixed style. Composers, great examples, Handel, Telemann, Bach, all wrote in these styles. There's no such thing as a German Baroque style. Now, in the French style, this typically left little room for the performer in terms of interpretation or free improvisation and ornamentation. French Baroque composers tended to indicate very specifically what they wanted from the performer. If you've ever looked at the manuscript copies of Marat Marais, those folios, which are the 5 old French dances are based on, you will see almost every other note is ornamented with what looks to me it initially is a very foreign, what the heck is that? But if you go in and look it up, there are even symbols that show how to vibrate. This is on the gamba, so not on violin or viola or cello, but that kind of rigidity almost in ornamentation. Now, the other Italian Baroque ornamentation and improvisation uh, is you'd find it, for instance, Telemann Concerto or Marcello Sonata, which are two great pieces that a lot of violists play. In just as in the Telemann, I'll play an example later, but it's kind of a bare bone uh, movement, and you wouldn't necessarily be expected to play it just as it is. You would very likely be expected in the Baroque era to improvise a lot. And I'll show you some ways that you can do that too. Another, or let me go back to Quantz here. I'm playing the flute. It's a little misleading, the title, because it's not just I'm playing the flute. He has extensive instructions for every orchestral instrument and what their roles are, and also numerous chapters on just general interpretation and technique. And there are three chapters that are solely devoted to ornaments. The first of those chapters is called Of Appoggiaturas and the Little Essential Grace Notes Related to Them. The next is titled Of Shakes. We'll get to that. And the last is Of Extempore Variations and on Simple Intervals. And that's one we probably, most of us are not going to do, but I'll show you some ways that you can include a little bit of that. So let's go to the appoggiatura, the first thing that is talked about in Quantz. It's also called a porte-voix. Let me share the screen here and just show you these words. So here we have the appoggiatura in Italian. Its French equivalent is the porte-voix. They have same rules, same everything, just different language. So if you want to look that up. So an appoggiatura or the porte-voix is a dissonance that precedes and is attached to the note that's being ornamented, the principal note. It's slurred to that principal note, not played separately, but slurred into it. And it's typically, by definition, a step above the note, the principal note. So it's approached by step. And when we talk about rhythmic divisions, if you see a printed appoggiatura, despite the value of that little note, if it's eighth, 16th, quarter, it is to be played half the value of the note to which it is attached. And if it's a note that has a subdivision of 3, by definition, it is 2/3 that value. Now, sometimes it feels weird to play with 2/3 the value. There's some writing that describing the appoggiatura is it should be so sustained so long that the resolution is almost unheard, which is a green light to say there's a lot of variation in there. So the rules are meant to be broken. The appoggiatura is played on the beat, if I didn't say that already. Now, some things to continue or thinking about when you're interpreting appoggiaturas or adding them. If there's an accompanimental part or a bass line or continuo, make sure that the ornament that you're putting in doesn't create a parallelism of fifths or fourths and other voices, or it doesn't clash with another ornament that's going on in the other part or parts. So you have to listen, and you'll hear right away if there's a problem, hopefully, if you're a good listener. So let me go to I'm going to show you some of what I'm talking about. So as I play, I'll keep this on as I demonstrate. So here we have an appoggiatura attached to a quarter note, and this is how it would be executed. Excuse me, those should be 2/8 notes. A little bit of a typo. So if that appoggiatura were attached to a half note F, it would be those 2 quarter notes. And in the next bar, of course, my appoggiatura is printed in the wrong place. I was up late last night doing this. But if we're going by the rules, the appoggiatura would be so long. There's another type of appoggiatura, or those little things, as Quantz puts it, the Lombardian snap. The Scotch snap that we might know, or the Bartok Scotch snap. And that's usually done with a separate bow. Another thing about appoggiaturas that you should know, or keep in mind too, is that the appoggiatura note is the note of interest. That's the spice. So lean into that note more than the resolution. So so don't be afraid to do that. It's much more interesting. Now, when you get to a cadential trill, so a major closing point, it doesn't have to be a full cadential ending or a full, it can be a half ending. You'll see here in the example, so we're in C major, we have the trill on the dominant function with the D, and this is how it would be played. You'll notice that I'm dividing in half a long appoggiatura to the trilled quarter, and then at a major cadence, you would always add some kind of terminal notes. Here I have 2 Nachschlagen. You could just do 1 note, or you could do some kind of terminal notes, but that would be very important, not to leave it bare. So we have so when you see a trill at a major cadence, use an appoggiatura always and make it a nice long one. Now, here's another ornament that Quantz describes. It's called the half shake. Sometimes, or he calls trills shakes. That's another word that was used during that time for trill. So this is the half shake. So here's the appoggiaturas. So you would add some little ornamental notes before the trilled note, or if you're not going to have a trill on that half too, you can put some little fun thing in there. The next ornament that we normally see is a mordant, or in French, passe, and this is the opposite of a half shake or a trill. So modern mordants are often written as a just this little symbol here without the slash. But in Baroque music, that symbol without the little slash in it is usually for a trill. So mordant, instead of being, here would be a trill to the upper note. Here we go. So it's going down below, the E being the dissonant note. The next ornament that we see a lot and that we can add is the turn, or in French, doublet. Modern turns, we usually have 5 notes. So if it's on F here, but in Baroque, remember I was saying that dissonance is the interesting part in ornamentation. So instead of playing from the principal, we start on the appoggiatura note. So it's a little bit shorter. Now, if a turn is placed, if you see this turn symbol and it's placed in the middle after the pitch or on a tie, that means that you're holding the F. So it's still a turn, but it technically 5 notes, but it's always in the middle of a slur. Now, this little ornament, the battement, it's that's very much like a turn, like a mordant. And despite the way it's notated, you probably play it on the beat. You can do just a little bit before the beat too. It depends on how fast the piece is going. If it's going very fast, it'll be before the beat slightly. So trills and shakes, getting back to the trill. Trill is the quick iteration and reiteration of a principal pitch with the step above it, or the auxiliary, as you might hear me talking about. Trills should try to avoid playing them at a consistent speed. They should vary in speed depending on the affect, and avoid any kind of busy bee, so buzzy sounding trills. So, and the variation of the trill is very important to the affect. Trills, you might hear this rule a lot, that a trill is always played from the upper note of the trill. And in Neumann's book, he does talk about this. But you take it case by case. You can go with that, okay, trills start from above, except when. And you'll hear, at least in my training, I heard a lot of different so-called rules, that only to discover that those rules never existed. There's nowhere that says you have to do something a certain way. So you might have heard that rule. Well, if the trill note is preceded in the horizontal line by the note of the trill, the auxiliary note, that you wouldn't start it from above. And that sometimes happens. When I get to the examples, I'm going to show you some different ways you can think about it. The auxiliary note, you should play that on the beat, treat it as you would in a paginatura. Cadential trills, as I said before, should have with a nice long appoggiatura in Nachschlagen. And you don't, and probably shouldn't use a trill through the entire duration of the note that's being trilled. You can start it late, end it early, put a big swell in the middle. And here's another example of that cadential trill. So let's talk about vibrato too. I'll stop the screen sharing here. And now, vibrato was considered to be an ornament during the Baroque era. In the way we think about it in modern playing is default setting, that every note should be vibrated unless you can't, or there's a reason not to. The composer said not to. But that concept of sound really didn't enter the canon of playing until well into the 20th century. There are performance specialists in Romantic music and music of Brahms, even, where it's described that musicians didn't always play with any vibrato, or not a lot, which is hard to imagine when playing Brahms without a lot of vibrato. So it was still considered to be kind of an ornament. So if you always just think, when I'm using vibrato in Baroque music, why am I using it? How is it enhancing my playing, or the interpretation, the affect, when you're using it? And Baroque players used it, so it's not like either or. So don't think that if you're vibrating that you're being inauthentic. That's not true at all. But just use it with good taste. Now, extempore variations. I had talked about this a little bit earlier. And Quantz goes into real detail about this, and it's an interesting read if you're interested in this. Now, as violists, if we were in the Baroque orchestra, we wouldn't be the ones doing this. It would be the melodic lines, the flutes, the oboes, violins, and solo keyboard players. But I told you about Telemann concerto being Italian. So here's the slow movement here of the Telemann. And so on and so forth. And it's a beautiful melody. But if you wanted to add some ornamentations, here is where I'm adding some, filling in the leads with running notes. So adding just a few ideas. So you can fill in either full scalar connections or partial scalar connections, whatever feels and sounds good. Another way is adding other chord notes to make double stops and chords of any of these notes, but especially cadences, you can do that. It really adds a lot of color to sometimes a pretty plain melody. You can substitute notes. You can replace the written note with another note inside the chord. So you have to know what chord you're playing under, what's being played underneath you in order to do that correctly. Another way to alter a melody is the French note inégale, or unequal notes. In some French playing, especially flute music, it's so uneven that it's almost hard to hear the resolution of the note. So here is the main melody, just plain, just eighth note. So a very gentle note inégale, before we even get to subdivisions, would be. And that's just a lightening up on the second note and releasing it, and a leaning in on the first note. So that's a very simple note égal. Now, if you're making it more of a triplet, and it could be, excuse me, in the opposite. That's much more rare to have the longer note at the end. You could also do. So if you wanted something with an affect that was brighter and happier, that would be a better choice to make there. Okay, so as Quantz states, and as he does almost at the end of every part of his book, when he gives instructions, he said the composer or the performer should know about all these rules, be able to execute them, but when it comes to the performance, always keep good taste and discretion in mind. So you can follow the rules, but if you're breaking them a little bit and it still makes the music more interesting, then by any means, go ahead and do it. Now, a caveat to all of this is that make sure that when you're playing or you're adding ornaments, that you're not ornamenting an ornament, something that's already an ornament that's written out. And this happens in solo Bach, because Bach, as with some other late Baroque German composers, wrote out ornaments, especially for string players. He didn't do it for some other instruments, definitely not for keyboard, probably because keyboardists would really be adept at interpreting symbols and didn't need to be given much instruction, whereas maybe a string player wouldn't have that much experience. So I'm just supposing. So when you're adding the ornament, look at the figure. I'm going to show you some examples, and make sure you're not re-ornamenting something that's already an ornament. It'll cancel it out. I call it, you know, putting a bow on a poodle. The poodle is cute enough already. Don't put the bow on the poodle. So let me go back to screen share here. I include this here. You can take a screenshot if you want. But one of the greatest keys to or decoders about ornamentation in Bach is this part of the Klavierbüchlein for his son Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. He wrote a little notebook for his son for their lessons, and he wrote out these ornaments and then realized them to show his son how to do that. So, and you can get this on the internet too, but you know, keep this around. It's very handy. Okay, now this is the sixth cello suite of Bach, and this is an example of Bach writing out ornaments. So you don't have to stop ornamenting when you get to this movement, but just realize that so already in those first notes, that's lower neighbor, upper neighbor to the back to the B, appoggiatura, and an échappé, which is upper neighbor, lower neighbor, going to the principal. So the opposite of one earlier. And then the next two beats, appoggiatura. You could add a trill there, would sound great. Terminal notes, Nachschlagen. Two appoggiaturas in a row. So falling appoggiaturas. And those 64th notes here are leading up to the trill. They're ornaments, getting the trill motor going, the trill, and then two terminal notes. So if you add something there, you're going to interfere with that. And so approaching the rest of it, I'll just play a little bit more. I'll start at the beginning again. I'm going to try with my body language to show you where the ornaments are. So on and so forth. But of all the suites, this is the most overt example of Bach being very specific about how he wanted ornamentation played, even to the point of rhythmic values. It's your job to pay attention to those rhythmic values and try and make it sound like it's being freely ornamented and not, you know, being exact. It's a very fine line and a very fun line, I think, to interpretation. So here you can screenshot this again. This is what's being ornamented. This is all the allemande is. Pardon that very poor execution, but I think you get the idea. So this isn't very interesting, but the ornamented version, very French, is worth the effort there. So that concludes this mini tutorial on ornamenting in music. And hopefully, I mean, when you know these things and you add this to your performance and experiment, and this can change from performance to performance. I vary mine, and sometimes I don't even know what I'm going to do until the performance. But it really makes the performance much more satisfying to you and the audience, I think. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you with the next video tomorrow.